Hi there, this is Edgar Allan Poe coming at you from the body of James Valvis, which I temporarily take over and inflict my opinions upon the world. Today I'm going to be talking about walking away from the Democratic Party. Although, to be honest with you, it's not so much walking away from the Democratic Party as it is walking away from leftism, walking away from the ideology that's driving the Democratic Party today. And it's always driven it, but it's driving it off a cliff right now. And I wanted to talk about how I came here, because I didn't start off there. I was a Jersey City ghetto rat, literally just about as poor as you can get in this country without being in Appalachia with no indoor plumbing. We were extremely poor. Both my parents had been on welfare. My mother was a 19-year-old high school dropout with 2 kids when she left my father, when he left her. It was kind of somewhat of a mutual parting. But, and she took off with my stepfather, and we were desperately poor, and eventually they got jobs as janitors for the Jersey City Board of Education, joined the union there, and things improved somewhat, but only somewhat. We were never wealthy enough to be comfortable in any sense of that word. And when I mean comfortable, I don't mean, we didn't have like, a cabin in the Poconos or something. I'm talking about we were hand to mouth. We were trying to get by all the time. Sometimes there was not enough food to eat. I went to bed hungry a lot. I could still remember growing up with hunger pangs all night long. It would keep me awake because I'd be so hungry. And when I went to school, I would have clothes that were too short, or clothes. There's a women pants that are called capris, and they come up to like halfway to your calves. Well, I was wearing capris when I was in 4th and 5th grade. I was wearing what was known as Skippy shoes, and they were hand-me-down sneakers from my sister. They were girls' shoes. Only girls wore these shoes in the ghetto. Even the poor blacks from Curry Woods and the projects would wear Converse or Pro-Keds. There was no Nike back then, but there was those were the equivalent type of name brand sneakers. But they weren't, those kinds of things were not provided to me, and so I would actually go to school with extremely clothes that were dirty and badly kept up, and so I grew up in this kind of rough, tumble neighborhood in extreme poverty. And in that time, it was believed, at least it was believed in my family, that the Democrats were the party of the little guy. They were the party for people like us, people who didn't have anything, people who were struggling and trying to get by, and the Republicans were for the fat cats. They were for the rich people. They were they only cared about the upper crust, or at least the upper middle class. They never, and somehow that wealth never trickled down to us, and that the whole trickle down economics thing was just big then. But of course, a Democrat was president at the time. His name was Jimmy Carter, and we all around us was the disaster of his poor policies. So we had double-digit inflation. We had high unemployment, what was known as stagflation. We had long gas lines due to his horrible foreign policy and inability to negotiate decent enough policies to get oil here. And we had, and then there were the Iran hostages, and that went on for 444 days, in which America was repeatedly shamed before the world, as day after day of these poor hostages in Iran was ticked off, and Jimmy Carter sent in a few helicopters, and they got, um, the whole thing went south, and it wasn't really the military's fault. It was just badly planned, and eventually, but it was a disaster all around. His whole presidency was a disaster. Sometimes I listen to people talk about Jimmy Carter, especially young people. I'm like, I don't know, I have no idea who you're talking about. You clearly you don't know anything about history if you think Jimmy Carter was a good president. He was a horrendous president. He was as bad as they get. People say Obama's the worst president ever. On the right, people say this. Obama was not the worst president ever. Obama, in some ways, was a more damaging president because he was a two-term president, and he was a president who commanded a lot of respect from a lot of people mainly because of his color. But he was not a worse president. He wasn't as incompetent as Jimmy Carter. In my lifetime, some people say that James Buchanan was the worst president. That's probably accurate. I mean, his actions directly led to the Civil War that cost America untold amount of suffering and pain. But in my lifetime, without doubt, Jimmy Carter was the worst president. And so all this was going on when I was a young person, and then Ronald Reagan got elected. Now, I didn't want Ronald Reagan to be. Nobody in my family wanted Reagan to be president. Reagan was going to blow up the world. He was going to destroy everybody. He was a war hawk. He was going to nuke the Russians, and we were all going to die. And we were all going to be screaming agony. And this was a common belief. There's a reason why the early '80s is the heyday for nuclear war films. And when you think about it, almost all the great nuclear war films or television series come from that era. You're talking about, films like Testament and or War Games, or later on in the decade you had Terminator 2, but earlier you had Terminator, which was a war, a movie that took place after a nuclear war. And then you have on television you had The Day After, and it all rose from the fear mongering that was done because Reagan was president. And so these days you don't hear about that. You don't hear that, Reagan was this crazy guy who was going to blow everybody up. But we believed that. We believed, Democrats especially northern city-dwelling Democrats like my family, truly believed that this guy was the apocalypse. He was going to come, and that was going to be it, because of his harsh rhetoric toward the Soviet Union. So this was all going on when I was maybe 12, 13 years old. So it's about 1982. Reagan's been president for a couple of years, and he had the first couple of years of Reagan's presidency. People forget it was not that great. The economy didn't turn around right away. It was still suffering. Languishing, and bad unemployment, bad inflation. It took some time for Reagan to steer that ship away from that, and especially because he was working, with a Democratic Congress who just they didn't want to do what he wanted to do, and of course it took some time to bring down the Soviet Union because he could only get his programs passed so fast. So it took a lot of maneuvering on his part, and some of that maneuvering ended up being pretty bad for us. I mean, the amnesty bill in California was a complete disaster under Reagan, and the deficit ballooned under Reagan, and there's a reason for that. There's a simple reason for that. Reagan was a Cold War hawk. He wanted to bring down the evil empire. He believed that if you took out the Soviet Union, the world would be in a much better place. And he was probably right about that. I mean, we're not on the brink of nuclear holocaust. But in doing so, the Democrats said, well, maybe we'll give you this Star Wars thing, but you're going to have to sign off on all this other stuff. And you're going to have to jack up this deficit as far as the eye can see. And Reagan said, well, maybe it's a devil's bargain. It's a Faustian kind of deal. But, maybe it's worth it to get rid of the Soviet Union, to get rid of communism, the scourge of that. You have to remember, these people killed tens of millions of people in Reagan's lifetime. So he was looking at this and saying, good God, these people are just horrendous. They're not bad. These are awful human beings who are just piling up bodies left and right, these governments. So if we can get rid of them, then maybe that's worth, going into debt for these people's, excessive social programs. Now, in the long term, it doesn't look as great a deal, but it was at the time, and I still think it was. I mean, you had to find a way to defeat that ideology because it was so bad, and it was so pernicious, and it was so dangerous because they had such weapons that at any time the whole thing could have blown up. So all this is going on, and I'm a 13-year-old kid. I'm in the 8th grade, and I'm thinking about, how am I going to get to school? Because my local public school, which was Snyder High, was so bad that my sister, who was one of the toughest kids I've ever known in my life, I've written lots of stories about her, called the Big Alabama Stories. And I mean, they're fictionalized. They're not really about her, but they're based on her. And she was this really tough girl. And so you had two things going for you. First of all, she was really tough. So that means girls generally left her alone. And second of all, she was a girl. So that means guys generally left her alone. It was even back then, even in the ghetto, there was more chivalry than there is today. So I'm not so sure that today men look at women in such a chivalrous way. I think that they pulled their punches with girls back then. They don't pull them anymore. But she went to Snyder High for about 3 or 4 weeks. I forget how long. Maybe it might have been as long as 2 months. And she said, Mom, either get me out of there or I'm dropping out because I can't deal with it. I just can't deal with it. And so my mother got her transferred to Ferris High School, which was another public high school, but not as bad. It was in a different section of the city. And so Georgia went off to Ferris, but I was left needing to go to school myself. And if my sister could not make it in Snyder High, there was no way in hell I was going to make it in Snyder High. I was a skinny, wimpish kid I was a cut up, and I was smart, but I was not in any way tough. And I was tough mentally, but I was not tough physically. I just couldn't hold my own there. And there was no way I was going to make it in Snyder High. Not 2 months, not a month, not 2 days, not 2 hours. It wasn't going to happen for me. And so I was desperately looking for a way out. I was looking for some other school I could go to. And there was one public school called Academic, but all the smartest kids across the school system wanted to go there. And so the competition was pretty high for poor kids. And I was smart, and I was going to what was an honor roll school that they set up called the Acceleration and Enrichment Program. And I was a smart kid, but I was kind of near the bottom of that honor class. And so you had a lot of poor kids and not that many spaces at Academic. And so I needed to find a way to get into the parochial schools. And the parochial schools were much safer, and they were much better academically, and they would lead to a better future. There was only one problem. They cost a lot of money. And they cost much more today. I looked at the tuition for prep recently, and it was something absurd. It was something like $15,000 a year, not including fees. I can't afford that. I'm in much better financial shape than I've ever been in my life. I could not afford to send my daughter to prep today. But at the time, it was something like $1,500 a year to send a student to prep. And well, that doesn't seem like a lot. In 1983, for a poor family in the ghetto, that was a lot of money. And new cars at that time were going for about $5,000. We didn't have a new car either. So it was a lot of money, and it would not have happened. At the same time that this was going on, my father, my biological father, who had not been involved in my life much at all up until this time, decided that he would come visit us again. And I think it's because my mother and my grandmother sought him out and said, listen, you got these two kids. You've never done anything for them. How about going there and seeing them once in a while? And so he started showing up and coming around for like weekly visits. And it was through him, I got him to pay most of the tuition at prep. And that's how I got there. But at the time, what I wanted to do, what I'd hoped would happen, because it was on the docket at the time politically, was that was school vouchers. And I read about school vouchers, and I'm like, this is the most wonderful idea I ever heard. For a person like me, for a poor ghetto rat, they'll give you some tax money so that you could go to a parochial school and not get killed in a public school where people are just going there to just to spend time, like a juvenile prison. And maybe you can't save everybody, but you could save some people. You could save me. And I said, wow, this is just a terrific idea. And I was like praying that it would pass somehow before I went to school, before I got out of grade school. And so I started researching this and how I might go about getting this if it happens. And what I found out was, I just naturally assumed that the Democrats would be for this. I mean, why wouldn't they be? They're for the little guy. Of course they'd be for this. It's just common sense. They're for the little guy. I'm the little guy. They're for me. Therefore, they're for this. Well, that was not the case. That was not the case then. It's not the case now. If you're a ghetto rat kid of any color or any creed, and you want to get out of the failing public schools, the Democrats are too fucking bad for you. That's their idea is, sorry, we got our unions to take care of. And that's it. We got our teachers' unions, we got our custodial unions, we got our trucking unions, we got all these unions, and they don't want to lose the money by sending you to some Catholic school. So it's not going to happen. And I don't care what happens to you. I don't give a shit. It doesn't matter to me. And well, let me tell you something. My 13-year-old eyes went boink. Why were the Democrats against me in favor of these powerful unions, but the Republicans were for me and not the powerful unions? Well, the Democrats would put a nice spin on that, and they would say, well, if you take away the money from the schools, then all the children will suffer. And it's just complete bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. They just want the money there because that money is going to the unions, and the unions pay for the Democrats. It's a tit for tat. It's a quid pro quo. That's all it is. That's all it'll ever be. And so, this wasn't enough in and of itself to turn me against. You have to remember, the person I loved most in the world, my grandmother, the person I still think most of in the world, the best person I ever knew in my life, was a Democrat. And so I wasn't just going to throw off my Democrats because they're wrong on one issue. I got the money from my father, And if you want to call him my father, he was basically an absentee guy. He was a sperm donor, is what he was. And he, I got to go to prep for a couple of years, and then I moved and went to, Tom's River, where they had better public schools. And so I went to a public school my final 2 years. But eventually I kept, that process, that thought process, that little, kernel of doubt, that little piece of sand that was an irritant in my mouth, began to make me question the solidity of the idea, the important idea, the all-important idea that Democrats are for the little guy, that they're the compassionate ones, that they're the caring ones, that Republicans don't care, that they're a bunch of, obsessed with their own wealth and their own greed and their own well-being. And they don't care about minorities. They don't care about women. They don't care about poor people. They don't care about immigrants. They don't care about anybody but themselves. And once that doubt started to creep in, well, then you start to look at other things. One of those things was clearly that Reagan was not the disaster he was predicted to be. It's the same thing that's happening with Trump now. Democrats overplay their hand. They say a guy is just the most horrendous guy in the world. Oh, he's terrible. He's Hitler. Oh, he's yellow. He's orange Hitler, and he's just going to come in and just destroy everything. Everybody's going to be nuked, and the economy's going to collapse, and kids are going to be raped, and people are going to be put in concentration camps, and they create this dystopian vision for this guy. And of course, it doesn't happen. It's just self-defeating. That only works if you can defeat him in an election, because once they win the election and they get to govern, and people realize that these fears were unfounded. They were not real fears. They were fears that were put into your mind. And so when they did this with Reagan, after a couple of years, after 3 years, and things started to improve, the economy started to improve, opinions about America started to improve, the Russians were getting their asses kicked in Afghanistan, America was on the rise, it was feeling greater patriotism, and things were looking up, things were looking better. Then you start to say, what? Well, if this is not what was supposed to happen. The predictive model failed, and if the predictive model fails, then there's something wrong with the model. There's something wrong with the mindset that says, there's going to be concentration camps for black people if you elect Trump, and then those camps don't happen. There's something wrong with the mindset when that happens. And there was something wrong with, I recognized this, even as a child I recognized this. And it doesn't take a genius, okay? I'm a fairly smart guy, but it doesn't take a genius to realize this. That when you think, all these horrible things are going to happen, and then they don't happen, there's something wrong with your thinking. You can't just fall back and say, well, I'm right, or it'll happen in the future. Because it's not going to happen in the future. You're wrong. Just admit you're wrong. Okay, so while all this was going on, I still did not turn into a Republican. Because, you grow up as you grow up. And I grew up as a Democrat. And I was still a yellow dog Democrat. When the election between George Herbert Walker Bush and Michael Dukakis came around, and Dukakis bobbed around in his little tank, and George Herbert Walker Bush ran the Willie Horton ad. I voted for Dukakis. It seems stunning to me now, but I did. And that's the way I thought. I just thought that the Democrats were right. And I was pretty radical in my views. For instance, I believed in um, the right for gay people to have civil unions. That was a radical idea. I believed in abortion within certain limits. Now, at the time, Democrats could believe in some, at least in some, and there were actually such a thing as pro-life Democrats. I know it's hard to believe now, but there was such a thing as pro-life Democrats, and they were mainstream. And there was such a thing as pro-abortion Republicans. They were also mainstream. But at the time, these things didn't seem to contradict as much as they do now. It doesn't seem even possible to be a pro. You cannot be against abortion at any level. That's the key here. At any level, and remain a Democrat, because they will simply not accept it. And so even into my first election that I could vote in, I voted for a Democrat. But I was never very political. I was always a moderate kind of guy. That's something of a slightly of a conservative Democrat. I liked guys that generally were buttoned down and boring. I still like buttoned down and boring guys. I mean, if I had my way, I would choose a buttoned down and boring guy as president every time over a charismatic guy. I just don't want that much drama in my presidents. Which, considering the last couple of presidents, that's I've not been getting my wish. But each side is responsible for that. That's not a left or right thing. That's just a culture thing at this point. So ultimately, I went through college and I was a Democrat. I went through the Army and I was a Democrat. Now, I didn't vote in the Bill Clinton elections. I didn't vote when he was running the first time against George Bush and Ross Perot. I didn't vote when he was running against Bob Dole, which I regret, by the way, because I should have voted for Bob Dole. Bob Dole's a good man, great American, great veteran, hero, and we would have saved ourselves a lot of national disgrace and struggle if Bob Dole had won that election. It was one of the great tragedies of the American experiment that Bob Dole did not win that election, because think of all the stuff we could have avoided if the whole Lewinsky affair and everything that arose out of that was avoided. And if we had Bob Dole instead as president, it would have been much, much better for our country. I personally think 9/11 wouldn't have happened. I think lots of stuff wouldn't have happened. Certainly George W. Bush wouldn't have happened. Probably Iraq or Afghanistan wouldn't have happened. All that kind of stuff would not have gone down. We would have had other problems. It's never. There's no such thing as a moment in history without problems. But what happened ultimately that turned me away is several things happened at once. And the first thing that happened was the Bill Clinton Lewinsky thing. I to say I was turned off by it is an understatement. But what really bothered me about it was that he was so virulently defended. Now, Bill Clinton is a grade A scumbag. I think everybody can admit that now. For 20 years, 25 years, Democrats defended this guy. But now the Me Too thing and, hashtag Me Too, and now they come out and say, "Whoa, this was a bad guy." Well, he was always a bad guy. And, he's not alone that Democrats supported. I mean, you had all of Hollywood cheering Roman Polanski. Roman Polanski held a child, a small girl. This is not in theory. This is proven. Held a small child down and raped her in the ass repeatedly, and then ran to another country to avoid prosecution, and then kept making movies that were celebrated by Democrats. And they did this for decades. And it wasn't like, oh, this is just stopped, this stopped 10, 20 years ago. This literally stopped like last year, where they finally decided to boot this guy from the American Film Institute or whatever it is. The Academy Awards and that kind of place. And so the prurient nature of this and the willingness to defend it just for a political agenda bothered me. That's first of all. That was the first click in the lock that turned me. The second thing that turned me was the 2000 election. And specifically, this isn't talked about much. A lot of people say, oh, the hanging chads, or they get all hung up on something like that. People don't remember this, but this really annoyed me at the time. Now, I voted for Al Gore. Remember, I didn't vote in the last two elections. I didn't vote for Clinton either time. But I did vote for Al Gore over George W. Bush. And I was quite adamant in my vote. I did not want a drunk in the White House. I thought that was, a bad idea. And I had a feeling that, the pressure would get to George W. Bush and he would, go off on an alcoholic binge and who knows what would happen. So that was my feeling about him. It was completely a character deal. And, but, they lost the election. Al Gore lost the election, whether it's by, 5,000 votes, 10,000 votes, doesn't matter. You lost. And when you lose an election in America, you lose it. That's it. You tip your hat to the other guy, you walk away, because that's the way it is. That's a republic. That's what it means. But not Al Gore. Al Gore didn't do that. Al Gore didn't tip his hat. What Al Gore did instead, and I'll never forget it, because I was upset he lost the election too for about 48 hours. And then Al Gore came out and he tried to stop the courts from counting the votes of the military veterans overseas. Now, I'm former military, as most people know. And the idea that you would try, in order to win an election, to disenfranchise the people out there defending our liberties, well, they lost me immediately. They lost me. The Democrat Party may have lost me forever over that one thing, because you just don't do that. Ever. It was so bad that even Joe Lieberman, who was Al Gore's running mate, wouldn't sign off on it. He said, no, I'm not going there. Joe Lieberman was an honorable man, by the way. Joe Lieberman would have been a better president than Al Gore by a lot, and he would have been a better president than George W. Bush, for that matter. But he wasn't on the top of the ticket, and I thought, not only would Democrats do and say anything to save Bill Clinton's presidency, but now they would do and say anything to get Al Gore in the White House, even to the point of disenfranchising their own military. Now, let me tell you something. Had Al Gore won because of that, can you imagine having a commander-in-chief of the United States of America who had disenfranchised military people in order to win an election? How the heck are you going to lead that military? How are you going to be commander-in-chief? And so that was the second click that made me walk away. Now, it's the second click in the lock. The third click was 9/11. Now, let me back up. Let me say, here's the third click. 9/11's maybe the fourth. The third click was the birth of my daughter. When my daughter was born, it changed how I see the world. I think it's true of anybody who takes parenting seriously. When you hold that poor, innocent child in your arms, this person who did not ask to be in the world, who is simply a product of you having some fun with your wife, and who's now taken on the mortal coil and must suffer all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune of life because you were getting busy 9 months ago, and you hold that person in your arms, that's got to change you. that kind of responsibility, the way you look at the world changes. It does. It's different. I have single friends or not people without children, and they think they understand this. They don't understand it. It absolutely changes you. It changes every way you look at the world. And if it doesn't change every way you look at the world, then you're not doing it right. You're not in any way responsible for that person. Now, my dad was like that. He just went about his business. To this day, acts like I was never born, to some degree. Every now and then he'll call my sister or something and say, "How come James doesn't have anything to do with me?" Well, you could have got in touch with me, and he can get in touch with me today if he really wanted to. He doesn't. So some people don't. It doesn't have any imprint on them. I've known other people like this where it doesn't have any imprint on them, and I think that those people are sick, frankly. If you can have a child and it doesn't leave any imprint on you, it doesn't change the way you see the world, it doesn't, and you cannot make a vow to that person to do everything possible to make their slide through life as pleasant as possible. And what I mean by pleasant, I don't mean that you'll always be able to just sit in your room and play video games, but I mean that you're not that person is not going to be out there struggling on their own in the forces and the elements. Then you're not really a parent. But I did become a parent. I became a person. And when I held that child in my hand, I said, well, this is it. Now I have to dedicate what I have in life to making sure that this person becomes successful and happy. And it's not just about me. It's not just about what I want. Her needs have to come before my needs most times. And when you understand that, then all of a sudden a lot of other things that look like great ideas back when you were a Democrat, they don't look so great anymore. It doesn't look so great to support licentious sex or to have a society in which anything goes. All kinds of misbehaviors either smiled upon or there's just tacit approval of it. It doesn't matter. If just take the debt, for instance. If you don't have a child, then what does it really matter if you have a large debt? As long as the country's not going to implode before you die, who cares? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter one bit if the country dies 10 years after you do. Who cares? You got yours. YOLO. You only live once. Doesn't matter. But if you have a child, and then you go on to project that child will have children that she or he loves as well, and that you will love as grandchildren, and that those grandchildren will have grandchildren that they love, and so on and so forth, then you have to project out to the future. You have to do this. And when you have to project out into the future, then you have to be virtuous. You have to say, I have to save for my daughter's college. I can't spend it all in Atlantic City. I can't spend it all going to bingo like my mother did. You can't do all this garbage that leads to bad results in life because I have to take care of somebody. And that's why, you go and you join the military, because you want to preserve liberty for the next generation. That's why you fight so hard to pass on the values that the founders had, because there's going to be a generation after you and a generation after that, and those people who come from you matter. So that was the third click that changed my political outlook and made me walk away from the Democratic Party. The fourth thing was 9/11. Now, I know that a lot of people when they experienced 9/11, they decided that the fault of 9/11 was not that we were stupid with immigration or that we had placated certain elements in society in a bad way or any other kind of domestic thing. Not that we had set up the CIA and the FBI to in a way that was, allow this to happen. None of that stuff. What they decided, and you've seen whole books for it, whole movements for it. What they decided was that religion was at fault. It was toxic religion that caused 9/11. And so why you see a precipitous decline in religiosity right after 9/11. They take a subset of Islam that committed this horrible, heinous crime, and they applied it to all religion. So you see this with the new atheists, with Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris. They took this tragedy and they said, you see, it's the religionists that do this. Now, they didn't make it specific. They didn't say it was Wahhabi Islam or even generally Islam. They didn't say that. What they said was it was religion. So it was all religions: Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, Hinduism, shamanism, paganism. Didn't matter. They took it and they slandered religion with it. But I knew that was complete bullshit. I'd grown up as a Catholic. I knew what we believed, and there was nothing in the Catholic faith that could justify flying a plane into a building. Nothing at all. If anybody flew a plane into a building or shot an abortion provider, that was contrary to the religion. Now, people do crazy stuff all the time, but that doesn't mean that the religion itself is to blame. The religion teaches what it teaches. The religion is separate from the people who practice it. I know that seems hard for some people to understand, but when a Catholic priest molests a child, that is not the fault of Catholicism. That is the fault of the priest. That is his sin. And when a bishop moves that priest to another place to avoid the trouble of that molestation, that's still not the fault of Catholicism. Catholicism doesn't teach people to do that. Catholicism teaches people that is horrendously evil. The fact that people do it within the Catholic Church doesn't mean that Catholicism is to blame for it. And the same goes for something like 9/11. The Islamic faith is not at fault for 9/11. However, the Islamic faith does teach things that are problematic. That is true. And you can judge them on that. And you can say, well, because they believe this stuff, it made a 9/11 more likely to happen. But that's not true of Catholicism. There are certain issues. In fact, it's almost the opposite truth with Catholicism. The further they get away from the true creed of their religion, the more likely they are to have these kinds of terrible things happen, like the child molestation scandal. Because people forget, like in the 60s and the 70s, and especially in the 70s, picking up steam in the 70s, and then into the 80s, and then even into the 90s, the homosexual lobby argued that you have to let these people into the Catholic Church. You have to let homosexuals into the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church kind of, well, but they're homosexuals. That's against, we find that to be intrinsically disordered. And they're like, it doesn't matter. As long as they're not doing it, they can be priests. And the Catholic Church says, well, we really do need priests, so maybe we should go along with this. And then they let these people in. And remember, the Catholic pedophile priest scandal was not really a pedophile scandal. It was a pederasty scandal. That means these were men molesting boys. These were homosexual acts. And so it arises out of that increased acceptance of homosexuality within the church. Now, the left can't have it both ways. They can't say, oh, you need to be more accepting of homosexuality, and at the same time, you're awful because you allowed these molestations to happen. They're not necessarily, they're connected. Unfortunately, they're connected. And so this was the fourth thing that really clicked and locked for me. I took the opposite end of that argument. I actually thought, when I saw 9/11 happen, I thought we did this. And I was an atheist at the time. So when I said we did this, I meant atheists did this. We have so gutted the very foundation of our culture that it left us unprepared to deal with these problems. You have people out there who believe that if you sing the national anthem, you're jingoistic, or you're fascistic if you're patriotic at all. You have people out there who really believe that saying the Pledge of Allegiance is an offense to a child's liberty. You have people out there who think that America is nothing but its faults. So it's nothing but slavery, and it's nothing but Jim Crow, and it's nothing but the slaughter of the Native Americans. That's all it is. They don't ever talk about anything good that it does, ever. It's always about My Lai in Vietnam, and it's always about Abu Ghraib in Iraq. The fact that we liberated millions of people from the worst of tyrannies, they don't talk about that. They dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They don't talk about how the Japanese went into China and were just horrible to those people. They were brutal in ways that we can't even imagine to those people. And we ended that. We ended that brutality. They don't talk about that. And I knew that, as atheists, we had gutted the very essence of morality. We smiled at it all. We cracked jokes about it. We laughed about the holy rollers and their stupid, idiotic, objective morality. We laughed at them. It's so funny. There's these morons who sit around pointing their fingers all the time and lecturing us about their morals and their stupid honor, and there they are dying. And I had teachers like this in high school. This is going back a long time now, but even then, the rot had set in. I'd been seeing it for a long time. And the thing about it is, no republic like ours can survive without virtue. The founders say this again and again and again and again. It's almost obnoxious how often they say it. That you cannot have a republic and freedom as we enjoy it, or as we have enjoyed it for over 200 years. You can't have it without virtue. You can't. It's not possible. You will lose it. You may lose it right away. You may lose it somewhere in the future. But you're going to lose it. Period. And when I look at the two parties, and when I honestly started looking at it, and all these locks clicked into place, I began to understand that one party was for holding the center and one party wasn't. That's the famous quote, right, from the poem. You got to hold the center, because the center doesn't hold. It doesn't hold itself. You have to hold the center. And the Democrat Party doesn't hold the center. The Democratic Party, in its balkanization of blacks, and everybody's a group. Everybody's a group. And they tear at the center all the time. They have the blacks biting at the center. They have the atheists biting at the center. They have the women biting at the center. Everybody's biting at the center, except for the straight white males. That's it. That's the only group that can't bite at the center. Once they give up, once they stop holding the center, guess what happens? There's only one thing that can happen. It's not like this is rocket science. You can only tear apart a tree, so you can only take so many hacks with an axe at a tree before it falls. America is a big tree, so it's taken a lot of hacks. But it can't take them forever. It just can't. And after 9/11, and after, and having the moral drive to have a future for my country, which is what my daughter provided, and after seeing the moral rot of a Bill Clinton and an Al Gore who would turn on his own defenders, I decided that I had to walk away. I decided that, in addition to, I haven't brought this up, but in addition to turning back to Christianity, not just because I began to think it was true, which is the most important thing, but also because I thought I began to see it as beautiful. I began to see what I thought was really new and interesting and daring and original, like, all the whole modern art wing of the museum. What I began to think was so transgressive and new and exciting was really just old crap. It was really just weak. It was really just rot. It was what happens when a civilization can no longer produce greatness. Go through any museum. Go through the Art Institute of Chicago, a museum like that, and go and look at the majestic paintings and the majestic sculptures and other art of the ancients and of the Middle Ages and of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and look at these paintings and look at go back from Van Gogh and before that and Raphael and you name it, and then compare it to Rothko or de Kooning or any of those guys, even Dali, who I kind of like. Compare them side by side, and ask yourself which civilization you would really want to live in. Which of those two representations of greatness is really great? I often say that I lost my atheism in a museum, not in a church, but in a museum. But I also found my patriotism in that museum. I found it there because I know what kind of country I want. And it's not a country where everybody just does whatever they want and everybody hates everybody else because of some past sin that happened 300 years ago. And none of the great things about the country are remembered, and only the bad things are ever remembered. And all the history is just, power dynamics of men versus women and blacks versus whites and poor versus rich. I don't want it. I don't want to live like that. I don't want to see the world like that, where I go out in the world and everybody's my competitor, everybody's my enemy, everybody is my foil. I don't see the world like that. I don't want to see the world like that. I would rather go there and be in awe of other people, and to trust them, and if possible to love them. And that is the Christian idea, to go out in the world and love people. It's not to go out in the world and find power. So all you hear from the left is how much they need power. They need power. It's all about power. They need power, more money, more power. Got to give us the power. The reason they're so upset about Trump is because they're out of power. They got to have power. Why do they need power? So they can defend your right to be as licentious and awful as you want to be. And yes, I believe in freedom. I believe to some degree that each man and woman has a right to their own freedom of conscience. But at the same time, I may believe that you're free to cheat on your wife, but I also know it's wrong to do that. It's wrong to betray people. And it's wrong to build a political philosophy around power and around doing whatever the hell you feel like doing. And so, ultimately, I had to walk away from the Democratic Party. And I'm not sorry I did. I hope that someday the Democrats will come back to being what they ought to be, which is the party that looks out for the little guy. The party that said, and the little guy that includes the unborn child, by the way, all the little guys. And it says, listen, we love our country. We don't think it's right to come into this country illegally or to disobey our laws or to behave in an improper way or to beat up people we disagree with or to silence them or to take away their rights as much as possible. But we're here to, do our best for disadvantaged people. That's the proper place for the left. And if they do that, I don't know if I'll ever join them again. But at least, it won't be so acrimonious. Anyway, if you agree with this, I hope you'll walk away. At least until which time they can come to their senses. Just walk away. I'm not asking you to join the other side. I'm not asking you to vote for anybody. I'm not asking you to give money to anybody, including me. I'm just saying, walk away from that crap. Thank you. And God bless you.